Hello friends, today we're going to be talking about Venus moving into the sign of Leo, which in the current transit, this will occur on June 13th, and Venus will remain in the sign of Leo until July 26th of 2026. However, the way I'm going to do this video, if you have this natal placement, this video will very much apply. And just to put this video into some sort of a context, I'm going to start with some questions, just to start directing our mind toward the discussion today. And I want to ask, why is it that sometimes another person's beauty inspires us, while at other times it can totally unsettle us? Or why is it that another person's talent can leave us feeling motivated in one moment and then feeling inadequate in the next? Or why is it that someone else's success can encourage us, while another person's success suddenly feels very threatening to us? And I'm bringing these up because these are very common experiences with Venus in the sign of Leo. Yes, I can talk about the usual thing that people talk about. I want us to dig a little bit deeper today, because beneath the question of beauty, talent, admiration, and recognition, there's a deeper question when it comes to Venus in the sign of Leo, which is what happens when we encounter value outside of ourselves. Do we appreciate it? Do we learn from it? Or do we experience it as something that's challenging our own significance? This is a struggle for Venus in the sign of Leo. And it's one of the central questions hidden in this signature. And I want to explore this. And the way that I want to do this, as usual, we're going to go through the layers of the video. But I want to bring a mythology into the picture today, which is the story of Inanna, which is also Venus. In the Mesopotamian mythologies, is when Inanna comes into relation with a mountain. We're going to watch this. This is very close to what we're talking about today with Venus in the sign of Leo. Because in this ancient conflict, there's a lesson about admiration, comparison, and how we generally respond when we are face to face with greatness, especially when that greatness doesn't belong to us. And the next video I have lined up is about Venus again in the sign of Leo, but all the aspects that it will be making in the upcoming month. And if you want to catch that video and more, please do remember to subscribe, press that notification bell so YouTube notifies you. And for my reading services, you can go to parisayazdi.com or to my email in the description box below. And now, without further ado, let's get into this video. And before getting into the myth, let's go through the layers of the signature of Venus in the sign of Leo. And if you guys picked up so far, everything that I talked about, we're talking about attention points. And we have to start here with this placement. Because first and foremost, Venus is a feminine planet, is of the feminine principle. So it comes to be about receptivity, connection, cooperation, attraction, and its ultimate aim is union. Venus's motion is of the converging nature. Venus attempts to bring things that are relational, because Mercury brought them into relation. And it's like, I like this. I have a preference for this. I want to join it. And this is why it's considered to be planet of relationships. Again, not like Mercury that has a little bit of distance. Venus comes close even that distance. Now, when we think about the sign of Leo, it's operating from a very different premise. First of all, Leo is of the masculine principle. So right away, dissonance to that feminine principle. Also, the sign of Leo is a fixed sign. And this sign is very much concerned with this idea of the self and self-expression from one's own center. It's a center that can now radiate outwards. If you just remember, I told you Venus is bringing everything to that center. It's converging and merging. Leo is starting from that center, and like the sun that radiates its light, it wants to radiate outwards. So Venus is seeking union, while Leo is in reality seeking some sort of a self-definition to be able to have a self-expression. Venus is moving towards others and togetherness, while Leo is moving towards having a defined and a distinct self-identity, the center of the self, where the self is sitting at the throne, at the seat of its own self. So as we can see, they don't have the same objective and they're not moving in the same direction. Hence the dissonance in the sign or the sign placement. And dissonance tells us that it's going to produce some challenges. It's like having a little bit of friction between two things. So we have to understand how the nature of this sign is changing Venus a little bit. And we got to understand this about Venus. Venus has a lot to do with this notion of value, not in the Jupiterian value on ethics, but the value of something. And if you think about it, Venus represents to our sensory system. So it's our capacity to recognize things. Mercury was deciphering it. Now, Venus is the one that's giving it the valuation of, I like this. I want to get closer to this. So it's the way that we come to recognize beauty, is the way that we come to appreciate excellence, feel attraction, and determine what's worth pursuing for us. This is Venus's job. So in many ways, the Venus within us is always asking, what matters to me? What's beautiful? What deserves appreciation? But Leo is asking a different set of questions because Leo is concerned with significance. Leo wants to matter. It wants to establish a sense of order, hierarchy, and its identity at the center of it. So we can see that when these two come together, when Venus comes into the sign of Leo, this notion of values is becoming something very personal. So the question can't just be about what's valuable. The question becomes about what does this value now say about me? And if you think about it, this is a subtle change, but it's going to change the trajectory of our psychology completely. Because now beauty is not just beauty. Talent is not just talent. And success is not just success anymore. They're now reflecting back to us our own sense of significance. And we got to remember, once value gets tied into our identity, our relationship to the world becomes very complicated. And that's because when we begin to drive a sense of significance from what we value, we become very vulnerable when we start to encounter value that we perceive as greater than us outside of ourselves. And we're going to see one of the hidden dangers of this in one of the oldest surviving myths in human history. As I said, is a story about Inanna, aka Venus, and a mountain. Yes, the goddess of beauty and a mountain. So let's get into the story. And I want you to know there's no way for me to tell you every bit of this story without this video turning out to be like an extra 40 minutes longer. But I'm going to link the scholarly translation of it into this video in the description box below. And I highly encourage you to read it. Super interesting story because it's showing us how we human beings think, how we have personified nature, and how that nature exists within us. And you're going to see very quickly how this story is very much like the signature of Venus and Leo. So all of that aside, let's start with the story of Inanna. And in the Mesopotamian culture, Inanna is one of the most powerful goddesses. She's associated with beauty, love, sexuality, power, fertility, kingship, conquest, and divine authority. I want you guys to know when you go back to the mythologies of Venus across different culture, we do not get this flimsy thing of just pink hearts. This force of nature has been described as warrior, as a conqueror. It has a lot of depth. I actually encourage you guys to look into Venus. Throughout many of her myths, even in the Greek mythology of Aphrodite, when you pay attention, she's a force that refuses limitation. And same with Inanna. She's always challenging established orders. She's constantly conquering new territories. And there's a deep desire within her to expand her realm of influence. In a lot of ways, she's the goddess of tremendous amount of ambition and intensity. And in the Vedic tradition, Venus's guna quality, its essence, its motion type is made of rajas, which is about activity. This is even though it's of the feminine principle, and feminine principle has been associated to receptivity and passivity, Venus actually doesn't have this quality. That magnetism that it has, it creates tremendous amount of movements. And Inanna's story is also explaining this. So going back to her story. One day when Inanna was traveling through the worlds, she comes across a mountain, which was known as Ebih. And when you read the text spends a considerable amount of time emphasizing how extraordinary this mountain is. It describes it as being elevated, magnificent, and absolutely beautiful. It talks about its flourishing forest, the diversity of its animals, and how it supports the animals, and how its grandeur reaches the heavens. And in the story, we see that the gods themselves hold this mountain in awe. So to state the obvious, we're not talking about a little hill or just any old mountain. This is a grand mountain. It's a place of immense beauty, vitality, and power. I know if you don't know much about Venus, you think Venus is going to come to this mountain, or Inanna is going to come into this mountain. And because herself is associated with beauty, she's just going to recognize beauty all of a sudden. Instead, Inanna looks at this mountain and she becomes enraged. And according to her, in the accounts of the story, she felt offended and enraged, insulted, because the mountain failed to acknowledge her. It says that she's enraged because the mountain didn't bow to her and submit. It didn't recognize her and her authority, and that the mountain did not show her reverence, the reverence that she believes that she deserves. And because of all of this, Inanna decides that the mountain has to be destroyed. Now, this is where the story becomes super fascinating. Because if you think about it, the mountain didn't attack her, it didn't insult or threaten her, or try to conquer her or to harm her, nothing. The mountain was simply existing as what itself is. And yet, this was enough to provoke her fury. And in the story, after this encounter with the mountain, she prepares for war. She arms herself, she gathers all of her weapons, gathers all of her forces to start this war. But before launching this attack, I'm kind of laughing because, like, we human beings do this too, even though all of this is metaphor. Before launching this attack, she approaches another god, which was a sky god named An. And this is a very important moment in this myth because An doesn't support Inanna's plans. An's kind of confused. And An's warning her and tries to describe the mountain's greatness, its beauty, its flourishing forest, the importance of its creatures, and that the mountain's powerful and its presence is important. And in some ways, he's effectively asking Inanna, why are you taking this on? Why are you choosing this battle? Why destroy something extraordinary? And it's kind of funny because Anne goes through this whole spiel, but it's almost as if Inanna can't listen because her decision was made, which is kind of odd to see why she even went to Anne. So after this part, she starts marching against the mountain and she unleashed devastation. She sent tears through the forest. She broke up its slopes, burned its landscape, and ultimately she declared it conquered. And this is the crazy part. After she has done all of this, she's standing before the mountain and she addresses the mountain directly. And what she says is remarkable because she doesn't accuse it of disrespect. She says, I have brought you low because of your elevation, because of your height, because of your attractiveness and your beauty. In other words, the mountain's magnificence was somehow part of the problem for Inanna. And you know, this is where the myth leaves us with a very profound question, which is what was Inanna fighting for? Because she wasn't just fighting the mountain. Was she fighting the mountain? Or is the story showing us that she was fighting what the mountain was revealing within her about herself? Because if we step back from the story for a moment, something becomes clear, and that is the mountain never changed. A mountain simply stands there and it exists. Yes, it's beautiful, it's powerful, it's magnificent, and it has an ecosystem that makes it self-sufficient. And it's certainly not something that deserves being destroyed. But when we look closely at the story, we see that the conflict exists entirely in Inanna's response to it. And this is where I think the story intersects with Venus and the sign of Leo. And I say this because of what I said earlier. Once value becomes personal, comparison becomes inevitable. And that's because every time in that case, when we face excellence, now that excellence carries a hidden question about us, which is, what does this person's excellence say about me? Like imagine two artists. One of them creates something extraordinary, and then the other one is just a mere witness to it. The artwork itself that was produced is neutral, but the observer now has a choice. In that moment, they can experience admiration, curiosity, inspiration, or they can experience deficiency in themselves, inadequacy or a threat because someone else who does something similar as them has done something where they have given it a value, where is now deducing something of their own personal value. What we're seeing here is how the relationship of the person has changed to the artwork. And this is why comparison in our world is such a powerful force. Because when you think about it, comparison is not fundamentally about another person. It's about the conclusions that we draw about ourselves when we are confronted with another person's value. And I think this is one of the most problematic encounters of Venus in the sign of Leo. Like with this signature and during this transit, we have to be mindful of how we perceive other people, what we perceive as excellence, beauty, inspirational, magnificent, and all of it without automatically turning it into self-evaluation. We can't personalize it as if some quality or attribute in another person is personal to us. Because when we are doing that, we are saying something about our own stance, how we are at the center of our own being. But all of that said, I think there's even a deeper issue underneath comparison. And that issue in itself is admiration, which is another dissonance that this signature can create. And when you think about it, admiration is kind of a strange experience. Because when we admire something, we're acknowledging that something possesses this quality that I find meaningful. We're admitting that I'm experiencing some higher state of being, such as beauty, intelligence, wisdom, strength, integrity. And if you think about it, admiration is always telling us that we're looking upwards when we admire something. And the mountain, when we see a mountain, what do? We look upwards, just as a side note. So when we look upwards, we're actually psychologically recognizing value outside of ourselves. And I want you to think about human psychology in general. Why is it that when we look up or when we look down, suddenly we negate our own internal state and we're constantly attributing to something external in the world? Admiration in its core psychology has this quality. And it's such a difficult thing to do when you think about it. Unless if you have worked out all the ego complexes, to admire someone else or to admire something in the world is a difficult thing for human beings. And that's because admiration in that moment of looking up is asking us to temporarily stop being the center of attention. Something else has just come to the focal point. It's about allowing something else to occupy the center of our awareness. So if you have worked out all of the ego complexes, admiration is an act of humility. Because when you're looking up, and if you can just admire, and you can give your attention and awareness to something else, that means you are at a lower position. And if you can be fine with that, you are a mature human being. But we saw that this is difficult because even a god like Inanna has a difficult time doing this with the mountain. The mountain was presenting Inanna with a choice, which was you can either look up and appreciate its magnificence, or you can start competing with it. You can admire it, or you can destroy it. And when we bring Venus into the sign of Leo, one of the deepest lessons here is about learning that if we look up to another person, that does not have to diminish us. We do not lose our own center and our own power, nor our personhood and our identity. It's really about understanding the complexity of existence. That greatness exists as nodes, multiple nodes in multitude of different places. And that the greatness of something else doesn't reduce our value, because the value that we see in something else is a value that we're designating to it anyway, is not value in itself. It's our perception and our interpretation. It doesn't have to be a zero-sum game that if I give that thing value, therefore I don't have value. Two things can have value simultaneously, but perhaps in different ways. You know, in Iran, we have a saying when someone says, "Oh my God, you look so beautiful or handsome today," the person has to say, one sees what one is, which is beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That's because we designate value. So we can designate value to others, but that doesn't have to diminish our own. That's one of the lessons. And if we stick to our mountain analogy for a little bit longer, we can see that the mountain represents something larger than admiration here too. As I was saying, there can be multiple nodes in existence. And the mountain is just representing another center of existence. And Leo is very much concerned with center of things. And those centers possess their own nature, their own reality, and their own place within the world. And this is a difficult truth that we human beings come to encounter throughout our life, which is that we are not, you know what, in reality, because there are a lot of philosophies that talk about this, we might be just one continuous phenomenon, but the way that we perceive things, things become segmented, differentiated, and different. But if I came up to you and I told you, you are me, therefore you should act like me, you should do what I want because you're me, you would be so insulted, you slap me in the face. The reality, the harsh truth that we have to come to learn as one of the first things that we learn as a human being is to understand that we're not another person, that they are their own center, that they are their own ecosystem, and they have their own ways. Like that whole separation from the mother, This is one of the first things our brain tries to help us to do in this life, which is mother is not an extension of me. I am not an extension of mother. Mother is mother and I'm me, and we're different. And we have to have that sense very well developed throughout our life when we interact with not just other people, but every facet of the world. And that means other people have their own lives. They have their own purpose in this life, value, destiny, and destination that's different than ours. And perhaps even more importantly, they possess the power and the freedom to direct their lives to somewhere different than us. And this realization in itself is a foundation of maturity. And that's because genuine relationships only become possible when we have this ability to recognize the reality of another person, not as a projection or possession, not that another person's an extension of us, but that we can recognize another center of consciousness that is self-possessed and self-governed. Another Leo in the world. I know Venus is kind of important here because Venus seeks union, but union doesn't mean absorption into another or absorbing another into oneself. Like Venus in Leo, it needs to understand love doesn't require other people to come into our worlds, that we become the center of their life somehow, that these different nodes can exist and it's actually healthy for that to occur. And when Venus matures here, we have a very dignified Venus here. Let's say the ruler of Leo, which is the sun, the dispositor, is in a sign where it's very well supported, is getting great aspects. It's in a house that's complementary to it, like the 9th or the 10th house. This Venus is going to mature really well in this life. And this is that Venus then that becomes loyal, that fixed nature of the sign, and it becomes dutiful because it understands the reciprocity in a healthy way. Now, with all of that said, and talking about the maturity of Venus, let's talk about some resolutions. What we can do to mature this placement and during this transit that we can bring out the mature aspect of this signature. But before doing that, I feel my body doing so I'm going to go stretch myself up for a second, grab a little bit of water. It'll be a split second for you guys. I'll be right back. All right, friends, I'm back. And I was just thinking, if there are Venus and Leo people that are watching right now, they're like, F you, Parisa. What? What do you mean? Where's our praise? You're not praising us. You're just telling us what the problems are. And there are a lot of good qualities that can come out of this placement. But before there's a sense of maturity, there can be generosity. But that generosity is coming from the wrong place. There could be loyalty, but it's to the wrong people. There's a sense that I am not appreciated in this life. This is a very common theme. I did so much for you and you did not appreciate it. Not understanding that so much of what we do is because what we need to do so that we have a sense of appreciation for ourselves. That's where the maturity is at. So this signature has a lot of qualities that's actually stunning. And I will talk about it in the next video. I think Venus in Leo people struggle. The sign of Leo is a very complicated sign. People like to say Scorpio is complicated. But try living as a Leo person. It's a demanding sign. And when you bring a planet that has dissonance here, it creates trials and tribulations in this life until we can figure it out, we mature, and we grow out of it. And with that said, let's move right into the resolutions. And I would say that the growth process of Venus in Leo and the growth process that this transit's bringing is that our value and our identity are not the same thing. Because when we're young, or when we're still operating unconsciously, it's very easy to confuse these two concepts. For example, we can become our beauty, as if we're forgetting that this is a transient part of the human life. We take pride in our talents, as if our talent is us. Again, a transient nature of human life. Or we become our value and our identity gets intermingled around our achievements. We achieve things and then we leave them behind. On to the next thing. Or maybe it's a season for rest. Maybe it's a dry season of life where we're not achieving anything. Does that mean that we have no value or a sense of identity now? This is why it's problematic. And we got to remember Venus in Leo is looking for appreciation and praise. And when they are praised for such things, they feel elevated. They want that admiration. Well, when these things are challenged, which is often in life, people don't admire us. We're just another body walking around the street, an unknown name, an unknown face. People don't give a damn. We're overlooked, surpassed, and when it happens, we feel it suddenly as if something's wrong with us, as if our sense of self, that Leo quality, is becoming diminished here. This creates a kind of a sensitivity in the person that's not healthy. And I would say the transit is about us seeing this right now. And we got to remember our talent, our intelligence, our beauty, and things of that nature are that part of Leo that wants to have an expression. These are mere expressions of us. They are not the entirety of who we are and what we are. Because if our worth depends on what we possess, then every encounter with someone who's more beautiful, by social definition, society's definition, more talented or more successful, these things become a threat to our existence. We live in a world of danger. Our nervous system is hijacked in that case. And that is a super exhausting way to live. You're never good enough. You want to be admired, and yet you feel inadequate. And it's also worth saying, as this understanding deepens, another realization starts to emerge, which is value in itself is diverse, a lot more diverse than we initially imagined it, which I was saying earlier, different nodes, centers of consciousness in this world, and they can possess artistic intelligence, brilliance, wisdom, courage, kindness, and all the qualities that we love. And we can possess the qualities that we possess. It's about understanding that life, the nature of life, its intelligence, wants to express excellence through countless forms. And nature in itself doesn't want to measure one against the other. This is human perception doing this. There's no golden standard where everything should be just like this one thing. When we're mature, we create this golden standard in the sign of Leo that becomes a self, and everything has to measure against this. Anything higher makes us inadequate. Anything lower is like, look at me, I'm the best. We gotta understand that the problem of comparison in itself, it's assumed that there's a single scale where all human beings can be ranked in this way. And the sign of Leo has a lot to do with ranking and hierarchy. The king is at the top of the food chain, so everything else has to be below it. So this can become a natural tendency, and in the right place, fine, this is the right thing to do, but not for Venus. This is a democratic planet that understands horizontal power and not vertical power. So this is another reason why it creates a problem here, and it creates a shadow in this sign. This placement's actually showing us that life doesn't work this way. When it comes to Venus's qualities, which is about love and merging, we can't have this ranking system and have healthy love. And if you think about it, everything has its own value. Like, I know a lot of astrologers, even using the language of our everyday modern times, to have a problem saying masculine or feminine nowadays, because we as human beings have now ranked them as if one is better than the other. But they are both valuable. That's what's making existence possible. This is like saying that if you're a musician, you have failed because you're not a teacher. They both have value, and they are not the same thing. And a teacher is not diminished because they're not an athlete. And a parent is not less valuable than an artist. This is what hierarchy does. Ranking, where hierarchy and ranking doesn't belong there, it creates these kinds of distortions. And Venus and Leo can create these kinds of distortions. We got to understand that each quality is expressing a different possibility. And that in itself is an expression of life. And when we actually understand this, this concept of comparison starts to lose its grip. We can't artificially impose it. Because like, let's say people say, go on social media, but don't compare yourself. You cannot stop comparing yourself until you understand the mechanism of comparison, which is very much related to this notion of value setting and how we're personalizing it. And going back again to that notion of admiration, which can often feel very dangerous, particularly when our identities are fragile. And that's, of course, because if we say that another person's great, if we have this comparison thing happening, it diminishes us. It's as if though the light of someone else takes away from our own light. But in reality, that's not how light works. If someone's full of light, you bring your light, more light. It doesn't mean that this light now casts a shadow on the other light. And to admire someone, it doesn't mean to surrender to them. And in the sign of Leo, we want to be in a position of power. Our sense of maturity helps us understand these concepts. So admiration in itself is a form of understanding when we have maturity, which is to recognize another person's beauty doesn't mean we become less beautiful. To recognize your wisdom doesn't make us less wise or dumb. To recognize another person's greatness doesn't make us less significant. It's simply recognizing reality for what it is, how nature of life in itself works. This is having greater consciousness that also can come out of the sign of Leo, because the sun represents consciousness and the sun is the ruler of Leo. And this brings us back to the mountain story. Because if we look back, the mountain was never actually a threat. Its beauty was not an attack on Inanna. The mountain simply existed because existence wanted it to be there in that shape and form. So however way other people are, however way we are, that's how we're supposed to exist. Existence needed that expression. And maturity allows us to see that there's room for the diversity of these expressions. And since Venus is a democratic planet, once one has that sense of maturity, it's more apt to see this than, let's say, the sun being here. Because the sun wants to rank things and put them in a hierarchy. But Venus now has the capacity to have that horizontal power relation viewpoint. But this requires tremendous amount of maturity, especially in the societies that we've been raised in. Everything is about comparison, everything in relation and relative to other people, which diminishes us. This is why mental health issues are related, let's say, to social media nowadays. And I want us to understand something again about the nature of existence. There's multitude in relation, at least from our perspective. So there are many centers interacting with each other. We're talking about interaction between different people, perspectives, sources of beauty, knowledge, wisdom, power. And all of these things in their diversity are worth loving. And Venus itself is about love. And again, Venus has the capacity to do this in this sign when it has tremendous amount of maturity. And love in itself is not about eliminating differences, is not about the absorption of everything into ourselves, but to understand that everything is an expression of love and it is worth loving. We don't have to diminish it and we don't have to diminish ourselves. A mature Venus in the sign of Leo knows how to appreciate reality. And in friendship of the planetary friendship, Venus and Saturn are friends. Saturn loves Venus. Saturn represents reality. Everybody hates reality. But Venus, as the planet of love, knows how to appreciate reality. Venus can know how another center has its own value and how it can come into relationship with it and how to even create a union with it. And I would say, if I had to sum all of this up, the deepest resolution for Venus in Leo is in our ability to recognize that the world doesn't have to become smaller when greatness exists elsewhere and when we recognize it outside of ourselves. In fact, if we can recognize greatness outside of ourselves, is telling us about the richness of the world, of the beauty of reality. And before concluding this video, please do remember to like, share, and comment. Let me know your experience of this transit. If you have this in your natal chart, definitely let me know how you have experienced this. And what is worth paying attention to for all of us right now with this transit is to see what it is that we're gravitating towards and we're having this sense of admiration for it and what our internal reaction to them are like. There's going to be moments that are going to come up where things become about compare and contrast, comparing ourselves. What are those things? Why are we doing it? What are we comparing ourselves to in reality? And I want us to pay attention what Venus in Leo is teaching us about our values right now. What is our own value? What do we value? What is our relationship to these values? I'd love to know how you're experiencing this transit. And if you want a reading of this transit, the upcoming trends, a full reading of your chart, or to just understand your life's purpose, why you exist, why it has unfolded the way that it has, you can go to my website at parisayazdi.com and my email's in the description box below. You can contact me directly. And now to conclude, I would say that the ultimate lesson of Venus in Leo is not about beauty, nor about romance, creativity, or attention. Those are very small parts. On a deepest level, Venus in Leo is asking us a very simple question, which is, can I remain secure in myself and secure in what I value? Can I remain in my own value while standing in the presence of another value that belongs to someone else? Can I admire without comparing myself? Can I appreciate another person without competing with them? Can I recognize the greatness of someone else without experiencing it as a threat to me? And this is super important to cultivate because life will always put a beautiful, magnificent mountain before us. People who are talented, beautiful, wise, and people who possess gifts that we ourselves will never possess. The question is, what do we do? How do we respond when we do encounter such people, which is inevitable? And we are that person to someone else too. So this is not just a question for you, it's a question for everyone. And in response, do we experience other people's light as diminishment of our own light? Or do we actually come to recognize that the world was never made just to contain your light? It wants multitude of light. And I'd say this is the lesson. The mountain was offering Inanna unto us in that story, which is greatness doesn't just belong to one thing or one person. Even within the mountain, there were the beautiful forest and creatures. The story is telling us that existence is vast enough to contain many sights and forms of greatness at the same time. And we've gotten to the end of the video, and before actually ending it, as Venus continues its journey through the sign of Leo, my wish for us is this. May we come to recognize and appreciate the gift that belongs to us without needing them to be greater than anyone else's. And may we find the confidence to stand in the presence of beauty, talents, wisdom, and excellence wherever they appear without experiencing them as a threat to our own significance. And may we learn to admire freely, love generously, and celebrate what's remarkable in others while remaining rooted in our own sense of self-worth. And may this transit remind us that a world filled with many sources of light is not a poorer world, but a richer one. And that's it for today. Sending you much love. Till next time.